The
Right.
short version is that I come from a background of architecture and theater. I've always been interested in using emerging technology to help forward creative visions. So the idea for Heavenue came about because we wanted to design a custom platform that started to give performers a lot more control over a live show and how they're perceived and what the audience experience is like, especially using the tools of Unreal Engine. So Christmas Carol in December was our very first show. At the time, we only had the VR side of Heavenue built out. So everyone who joined the show was in an Oculus Quest, streaming their experience from the cloud at very high fidelity, while our actor playing Scrooge and Dickens and other Christmas Carol characters was wearing an accent suit, using the free app on his phone called Livelink Face, and Manus gloves, and getting a very, very, very high fidelity experience out of that for everyone to see, far beyond anything that you'd be able to any experience that you'd be able to have in any other application right now. And since then, since December, we're building out a lot more tools for making our experiences more accessible for people who don't have VR headsets. So now anyone who wants to see one of these shows, they can just join from a browser. XR-chitecture is very much to imply, and I think it comes across better in print, that I've gone from designing real buildings in the world to virtual buildings, and buildings that are primarily experienced in augmented reality and virtual reality. You don't necessarily replicate it. There's a lot of affordances in virtual reality that are good to take advantage of. You know, it's a balance though, because on the one hand, there's this term skeuomorphism, which is about trying to replicate things that people are familiar with. And that's a really good tool for virtual reality and augmented reality, because it gives people kind of a stepping stone toward behavior that they're already comfortable with. And a theater is a really good example of. In virtual reality, we can make the audience avatars look like anything. We can let people or performers fly. We can play with scale. We can turn off gravity. We can do things that mean that we're not worrying about things like the weather, you know? So a ceiling typically in architecture is to keep the elements out. And that doesn't mean every virtual piece of architecture doesn't need a ceiling, because a ceiling serves other aesthetic purposes, just like walls. It becomes a tool for space making and hierarchy. And you can still go into architectural psychology to encourage certain kinds of behavior in virtual reality. Psychologically, humans are just drawn to certain kinds of colors and shapes. And so totally beyond the functional purposes that architecture serves in the real world, there's a lot of really interesting ways to guide the eye in VR and to make people feel a certain way. But the wonderful thing too is that it's so easy to create a piece of virtual architecture and to iterate on it and to say like, okay, now I see how people are using it. Let's modify it and try again in a way that you just absolutely cannot do with real world architecture. So, over the years, working both on real architecture using virtual reality and virtual architecture in virtual reality, we worked on a Magic Leap piece, for example, called Ghosted, which was like a ghost speed dating experience where we volumetrically recorded using Depth Kit, a whole bunch of actors giving little monologues about why their ghost should be the one that you should choose to haunt you for the rest of your life. It's kind of like a Tinder sort of thing for ghosts. We had a 3D model of the venue, but even though it was an augmented reality experience, what we did was we put that augmented reality experience into virtual reality. So we actually had a sense of how it would fit into that particular venue. We knew we wanted these ghosts to be sitting across from you from these tables. It was really useful to know the dimensions of the tables and to start to think about, okay, we don't want people looking right at the window because there's going to be glare. Let's rotate them this way. Let's confirm that these tables can be moved the way we want them to, and just kind of pre-visualize the entire augmented reality experience through virtual reality. That kind of stuff is very cool. Yeah, it's really been something inside of me for a very long time. I've always felt limited ever since I was quite young. I felt limited by the tools that I had available to myself, and always felt like the tools at my disposal were very limited. And that has to do with expense and time and resources and manpower, because it takes a lot of people and effort to do things in the real world, well, this feels like totally different from anything I've ever seen before. And it was kind of, low frame rate and bad graphics. I remember everything was very yellow in it. But even then, I was starting to think about ways this new technology could be really helpful of trying to convey something that isn't created yet. Is what's it like to move from one space to another? What's it like to go from a very tight and compressed space into a large and open space, or dark to light? So that's the level that we had built out Heavenue for Christmas Carol. Now we're much more accessible, because now anyone with a web browser can pop right in. They don't need to be in VR. They can just use their phone or their Chromebook. It can be a very low end computer, because all you need is a strong enough internet connection to broadcast the signals. So we're trying to harness cloud computers to make it so that you don't need to worry about the local hardware. Yeah, so Cloudxr is what we use from NVIDIA for, or it's still what we have connected to our system for VR. And so that basically allows everyone's headset to have like a connection to a particular virtual machine. And we've set up an infrastructure that allows this to scale infinitely. So you could have, 1,000 people attending a show, and then every single one of those headsets is connected to something, to a particular virtual machine that's going to be just for your headset. So you open the app on your headset, and then you're immediately in VR. And the nice thing about that too is you can pretty significantly cut down on load times. And it's also much easier to get out of your headset, because if you're in the middle of the show and you need to go grab some popcorn or a drink or something like that, you can take off your headset and the show is going to keep going. But as soon as you put the headset back on, you'll be right there, versus in other kinds of, if you're running something locally, your headset might crash or go to sleep, or you might need to restart the experience. Metaverse is a very loaded term. And when people talk about how these technologies bring us closer to a true metaverse, for me, there's a VR side to this and an AR side to this. The VR side is all about presence. It's making us feel like we are in an environment that isn't actually real, with people who aren't actually right in front of us. And that has a level of connection that really can't be offered by any of the, let's say, existing 2D metaverse platforms. Like, I've had experiences in virtual reality hanging out with people who I've never met in real life, and it gets very, very, very close to exactly what it feels like to actually be hanging out with real people in real life. And some of my best friends in virtual reality are people who I still haven't met, which is pretty fascinating. And in some cases, I know what they actually look like, because we've also done like Zoom calls. And in some cases, I only know them by what their avatar looks like. And that's a fascinating level of control over self-image and privacy. That kind of freedom of self-expression, I think, is really key to a metaverse moving forward, combined with the fact that you really feel like you're there with people. The real world in an exciting way, where there's certain things that you can only do in virtual reality, and you want to do those things in virtual reality, but there's still plenty of exciting things to do in the real world. And some things are best done experienced with no digital layer at all. But some things will actually be very interesting with an augmented reality layer on top of the world. So this is where we get into, an augmented reality metaverse, because it's really useful and interesting to be able to go around the world with contextual data. Virtual reality allows a very high freedom of self-expression. Augmented reality potentially allows for an uncomfortable level of forcing other people to look a certain way to you. And if you don't know how you're perceived by someone else's augmented reality, that can be a little bit unsettling. I mean, it's quite the opposite of freedom of self-expression.